This is Lecture 65C that accompanies Volume 4 on Oceania and the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018 book. And in this particular series, it's Lecture 65C, and we're dealing with the transitional chiefdoms of Easter Island. Now, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, R-A-P-A-N-U-I, two words, in its native language, rises from the South Pacific 2,000 miles directly west of the Chilean capital of Santiago. It is a small 63 square mile patch of land, more than 1,000 miles from the next inhabited spot in the Pacific Ocean. In AD 1200, a radiocarbon study recently completed says a small group of Polynesians, probably several boatloads, I think, of simple chieftain people, made their way there, settled in, and began to farm. Now, upon arrival, the place was covered with 16 million trees. Some were 100 feet high. A 26 study indicates the deforestation of the island started around the same time as their arrival. Now, a large, now extinct palm, scientific name of which is Pachalococcus disperta, related to the Chilean wine palm Jumea chilensis, was one of the dominant trees as attested by fossil evidence. P. disperta's sole occurrence was on Easter Island, and it became extinct due to deforestation by rats brought by the early settlers. Now, these Australian Polynesians who first settled the islands came from the Marquesas Islands to the west. They brought with them bananas, taro, sugarcane, paper mulberry, chickens, and Polynesian rats. The island eventually supported an advanced theocratic chieftain. Now, why search so far afield? These immigrants on the road of the winds sought an isolated island because of the high levels of ciguatera fish poisoning in their home islands, poisoning the fish and poisoning the humans. Ciguatera outbreaks caused by warmer climate conditions propelled the migratory voyages of Polynesians between AD 1000 and 1400. After an encounter with the plague of ciguatera poisoning and having the perspicacity to determine its cause and see it as a serious endemic threat, some chiefdoms decided to take off. Now, ciguatera is a foodborne illness caused by biomagnification, that is, eating certain reef fish whose flesh is contaminated with polyether toxins including ciguatoxin, mitotoxin, gambieric acid, and scarytoxin, as well as the long-chained alcohol palytoxin. These toxins are made by dinoflagellates such as Gambierdiscus toxicus that live in tropical and subtropical waters. These dinoflagellates adhere to coral, algae, and seaweed, where they are eaten by herbivorous fish that in turn are eaten by larger carnivorous fish like barracudas, and even omnivorous fish like basses and other fish like mullet. Ciguatoxin is odorless, tasteless, and cannot be removed by conventional cooking. Other dinoflagellates that can cause ciguatera include the Prorocentrum species, the Ostropsis species, the Culia monotus, the Thecadium species, and the Amphidinium carterae. Predator species near the top of the food chain in tropical and subtropical waters are most likely to cause ciguatera poisoning, although many other species cause occasional outbreaks of toxicity. And all of this is to a certain degree controlled by the El Nino, which we'll get to in a moment. The religion of the Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, and its advanced theocratic chieftain. Easter Island gets its name from the arrival of the Dutch explorer on Easter Sunday in 1722. Its name, according to the Rapa Nui people, was Rapa Nui Island. Oral history among Easter Islanders claims that a chief, Hotu Matua, arrived on the island in one of two large canoes with his wife and extended family, and this legend says that they were all Polynesian, and this idea is a central tenet of the ideology of the Easter Island ATC. However, it is 1,000 moai stone sculptures that cover the island, some as tall as a 3-story building, that are the most striking feature of the Easter Island ATC religion. The Moai do not look outward from the island to the sea. Nearly all face into the interior of the island, the ideological tenet being that when you look at them, you are facing the cosmos from which Rapa Nui's seafaring ancestors came. In AD 1774, when Captain James Cook visited, he recorded roughly 700 islanders from an earlier population of thousands. They were living marginal lives, their canoes reduced to patched fragments of driftwood. Yet these same people had managed to carve almost 1,000 enormous statues called Moai, M-O-A-I. These statues have giant, hollow-eyed, gaunt faces, some weighing as much as 75 tons. The statues faced not outward, not to the sea, but inwards, toward the now empty, denuded landscape, and we have seen the reason for that. When Captain Cook saw them, many of these Moai had been toppled, lying face down as if in abject defeat. Professors Terry Hunt and Carl P. Lippo say fossil hunters and paleobotanists have found no hard evidence that the first Polynesians set fire to the forest to clear land for what is called large-scale prehistoric farming. The trees did die, but not from fire, but from rats. Polynesian rats, Rattus exulans, had stowed away on those canoes. Once they landed with no enemies and lots of palm roots to eat, the rats went on a binge, eating and destroying tree after tree, and multiplying at a furious rate. As a reviewer in the Wall Street Journal reported, in laboratory settings, Polynesian rat populations can double in 47 days. Throw a breeding pair on an island with no predators and abundant food, and arithmetic suggests the result. If the animals multiplied as they did in Hawaii, the authors calculate that Eastern Island would quickly have housed between 2 and 3 million. Among the favorite food resources of R. exulans are tree seeds and tree spouts. Humans surely cleared a little forest, but the real damage would have come from the rats that prevented new growth. As the trees went, so did 20 other forest plants, 6 land birds, and several seabirds. So there was definitely less choice in food, a much narrower diet, and yet people continued to live on Eastern Island, and food, it seems, was not their big problem. For one thing, they could eat rats. As J.B. McKinnon reports in his new book, The Once and Future World, archaeologists examined ancient garbage heaps on Easter Island looking for discarded bones, and found that 60% of the bones came from introduced rats. Therefore, they had found a meat substitute. Even though the islands hadn't much water, and its soil wasn't rich, the islanders took stones, broke them into bits, and scattered them on open fields, creating an uneven surface. When the wind blew in off the sea, the bumpy rocks produced more turbulent airflow, which released mineral nutrients into the rock, according to McKinnon. He says they gave the soil just enough of the nutrient boost to support basic vegetables. 1/10 of the island had these scattered rock gardens, and they produced enough food to sustain a population density similar to places like Oklahoma, Colorado, Sweden, and New Zealand. According to McKinnon, scientists say that Eastern Island skeletons from that time show less malnutrition than people in Europe. When the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen happened by in 1722, he wrote that islanders did not ask for food. They wanted European hats instead. And of course, starving folks typically do not have the time or energy to carve and shove 70-ton statues around the island. Because, say the Hawaiian anthropologists, clans and families on Easter Island did not fall apart. It's true, the island became desolate, emptier. The ecosystem was severely compromised. And yet Easter Islanders didn't disappear. They adjusted. They had no lumber to build canoes to go deep sea fishing. They had fewer birds to hunt. They did not have coconuts. Nevertheless, they kept going on rat meat and small helpings of vegetables. They made do. If everybody was eating enough, why did the populations decline? Probably, the professors say, from sexually transmitted diseases after Europeans came visiting. Humans are a very adaptable species. We have seen people grow used to slums, adjust to concentration camps, learn to live with what fate hands them. On Easter Island, people learned to live with less and forgot what it was like to have more. In summary, we know the origin of the first inhabitants was Polynesia, probably the Marquesas Islands. The date of their arrival was about AD 1200. When they arrived, the voyagers found an island teeming with life. Today it is mostly treeless, yet the island was once covered in forests of a now extinct palm that towered 100 feet and was, while it lived, possibly the tallest in the world. The trees were killed off by rats, which ate their seeds and shoots faster than they could regenerate. Fossil palm nuts are invariably punctured by rat teeth and could never have germinated. Studies from Hawaii show rats can multiply into the millions in a few years and have profound effects on ecosystems. There is no evidence that islanders ever transported the statues horizontally, and thus that they used timber sleds. The moai, they assert, were moved vertically with ropes and muscle, rocked and pivoted like refrigerators along roads radiating out from the quarry where they were hewn. Those roads can still be seen today, and all along them there are moai that have plainly fallen and broken into 2 or more pieces on impact. This transport could not have happened if they were sliding horizontally. Oral traditions speak of the statues walking upright to their ritual sites. Far from being the source of Rapa Nui's downfall, moai construction, in the view of Hunt and Lippo, had the effect of keeping the population down. Citing studies of other societies in extremely resource-challenged environments, such as the Inuit, they view the making of moai as a classic bed-hedging strategy where people channel the reproductive urge into something else, in this case statues. It may not be a conscious decision, but people in many societies will forego having children in favor of engaging in massive civic or important personal projects. The population stood at manageable 3,000 when the first Europeans arrived. We know that monumental architecture, as in statue erecting, means only that a society has reached the level of an ATC. It does not necessarily mean that a class-divided, state-organized kingdom has emerged. Variations in moai style from village to village suggest several ATCs occupied the island, and not one kingdom. Easter Island shows none of the hilltop fortifications or defensive earthworks seen elsewhere in the South Pacific, where class-divided, state-ruled kingdoms had emerged. Hunt and Lippo note that the trench on Easter Island's eastern side, that tour guides explain was dug by one faction to bury the other alive, is a natural formation caused by the confluence of 2 lava streams. Collapse followed the introduction of European disease, and that is the end of the story. On Easter Island of 1722, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived, and he described well-tended gardens, hundreds of standing statues, and in his words, whole tracts of woodland that were remnants of the native forest. He stayed a few hours, just long enough for his men to introduce venereal disease to the trusting, curious islanders. But even if they were not normally promiscuous, over the next 48 years that followed Roggeveen's visit, other Dutch visitors would have caused the population to plunge to a few hundred. In 1770, the Spaniards arrived and stayed for 6 days, long enough to land plenty of microbes. Warmly received, the Spaniards remarked on the island's liberal sexual mores and how the native men did not object when the women offered the visitors their favors. In 1774, the next visitor, Captain Cook, arrived and found the place a wreck. Islanders were living in miserable huts and caves, he said, and human bones were lying about. The scene was precisely what the aftermath of epidemic and a population crash would look like, as the book The Statues That Walked puts it. The Europeans knew nothing of germ theory, and in any case never stayed long enough to see its effects. More traumas followed. In one of the best chapters of that book, The Statues That Walked, the authors explain how the arrival of European goods led to the collapse of Moai traditions. They were entranced by the jaunty hats, jackets, tools, and weapons brought by the outsiders and brazenly stole them. With these new symbols of prestige, the old ways lost their value. Combined with the new and obviously superior gods, the Rapa Nui people neglected their Moai. In time, they toppled over and were not leveled in an iconoclastic frenzy as previously posited. In 1830, only 8 statues stood on their original platforms. At the quarry, there are hundreds of half-carved Moai abandoned when the cult died. The island became a popular port of call for adventurers and whalers from all over Europe and America, attracted by its sweet potatoes, bananas, idols, brackish water, and sex. For a time, ships' captains avoided the island because of its reputation for syphilis. In 1845, claims of cannibalism appeared in a French hoax of a sailor who returned to the ship covered in teeth marks, alleging that islanders tried to eat him alive, this reinforced colonial stereotypes about the heathen past. This gave an impetus to the coming missionaries who were settling in to save their souls. In 1862, the final, nearly fatal blow arrived in the form of Peruvian slave raiders who rounded up over 1,400 islanders and shipped them to Peru to dig guano. Many were by then Christian converts, and the forcible blackbirding drew international condemnation, but it came too late. The few pustuled, that is, islanders with pustules, who straggled home brought a new wave of smallpox. By 1868, not a single Moai stood. Its native worship was dead. The island became little more than a brothel. By 1877, the population was down to 110 people. In 1888, Chile annexed the shattered island and turned it over to sheep ranchers, whose livestock extinguished what little was left of the native vegetation. The majestic native palm finally disappeared. Somehow, the Polynesian language of the island survived as one of the few living connections with the past. You hear it today in shops, homes, and hip-hop bands, muddled with Spanish but unmistakably alive. 100 or so mighty Moai have been re-erected on their platforms. Now, for a chronology of Easter Island's material culture. The people who settled in Oceania, as you will recall, originated in southern China, moving south about 40,000 years ago. They are associated with the Proto-Papuan language population. The first waves of Proto-Polynesian colonists left the continent around 8,000 BP, reaching Taiwan about 6,000 BP, and Papua New Ireland and New Britain about 4,000 BP. There, the Lapita culture emerged, and the large double-hulled canoe was invented. It was their most important innovation for sea voyages. These were the vessels the Austronesian-speaking peoples would later use to reach all the Pacific Islands. Over the millennia, there were two-way exploratory journals based on celestial navigation and familiarity with ocean currents. Polynesians would colonize and subsequently form the homogeneous archaic Polynesian culture. Current research indicates that the first colonists appeared on Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa about 850 BC. The Cook Society, Marquesas, and Hawaiian Islands were not settled until AD 800, and New Zealand not until AD 1200. This is what we know, and of course it affects the discussion about the first settlement of Rapa Nui. Now, the late colonization of Easter Island. Contemporaneous research has cast doubt on practically all of the early radiocarbon dates too, indicating important factors that could have caused distortion. The next most important event in Easter Island periodization was an article that appeared in Science in 2006 by Professors Terry Hunt and Carl Philip Lipo, and I give the reference. Its authors put forward an incisive hypothesis concerning the settlement of Easter Island on the basis of a precise analysis of the earlier radiocarbon dates and, more importantly, their own archaeological excavations. The 2004 and 2005 expedition on the Anakina Dune site is the title of that article. Now, Engelbert produced 8 new radiocarbon dates. That's Sebastian Engelberg. The abstraction of that article says Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, provides a model of human-induced environmental degradation. A reliable chronology is central to understanding the cultural, ecological, and demographic processes involved. Radiocarbon dates for the earliest stratigraphic layers at Anakeena, Easter Island, and analysis of previous radiocarbon dates imply that the island was colonized late, around 1200 AD. Substantial ecological impacts and major cultural investments in monumental architecture and statuary began soon after initial settlement. The Anakeena Dune site is one of the oldest on the island. It is well preserved, and it has 11 feet of stratigraphy that is the best preserved on the island. The lowest layer has traces of human activity containing large amounts of animal remains, while the high percentage of them are sea animals. That is, mammals such as pinnipeds, turtles, and fish. And it's worthy of notice because it is additional evidence of its age. The Rapa Nui menu changed with time, containing less and less seafood. All of the 8 new dates are AD 1200 AD, and the authors project that Easter Island was settled between AD 1050 and 1150, which tallies with the dates for the earliest Managareva sites. Their argumentation is reinforced by the observation of the first signs of human pressure on the island, which appear around AD 1200 and escalate after AD 1300. And the reference there is to the Hutton-Lipo 2008 article. From this perspective, an earlier chronology would mean practically no human influence on the ecosystem for over 400 years, and this would be next to impossible, as there is no scenario of this kind in any other region or even archaeological site in the world, and the reference for that is Hutton-Lipo in 2006. Now, very recently, another text has been published with an analysis of 134 radiocarbon dates from all over Polynesia by Wilmshurst et al. In 2010. According to her findings, populations from Samoa and Tonga settled all the Polynesian archipelagos to the Society and Gambier Islands between AD 1025 and 1120. A second wave of colonists reached all the other parts of Polynesia in a very short time between AD 1200 and 1290. It was precisely this second phase of migration that colonized New Zealand, AD 1230 to 1282, and Easter Island, AD 1200 to 1253. A review of the scientific literature shows a tendency to redate archaeological sites in all of Polynesia, and this new picture of Polynesian prehistory concurs with the striking genetic, linguistic, and cultural homogeneity of the region, especially its eastern part, which has been studied continuously since the beginning of scientific research, and I'll give the reference for that. Now, colonization at such a rapid rate was caused by several factors, including a population explosion, purposeful exploration, new sailing inventions such as windward sailing, and global climatic and environmental changes. All of this in the Wilmshurst et al. 2010 article, which brought famine and disaster, prompting migration, and Perry and Sue, HSU, review all of that in their 2000 article. The 13th and 14th centuries marked the beginning of the Little Ice Age, and by ENSO, that is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, forcing in the Pacific around AD 1200 to 1300, and I give all of the references for this. One of the characteristics of this phenomena is the emergence of westerly winds, which means a reversal of the usual direction. In this situation, eastward journeys by sea are possible much easier and faster. This would have assisted migration, along with the navigational advance in tacking against the wind that was common by this time in the South Pacific windward and counter-windward sailing, and that would have been normal. The ENSO-related droughts and fires could also have encouraged the people of Oceania to venture on organized, purposeful searches for new habitable lands, and the depopulation of several islands at this particular time, because of diseased fish, could have encouraged these movements. Again, there's a lot of references in the text, which we don't need to go through here. All this means fundamentally a new chronology for the cultural culture history of Easter Island. The date of first settlement is being continually moved forward with new research, and according to contemporary scenarios, the Rapa Nuis, just like other Polynesians, started to erect their ceremonial architecture almost immediately after landing. The human ecological impact is promptly visible too. Reconstruction of the successive settlement and exploitation phases now allows us to assume with confidence that the coastal part of Rapa Nui was settled within 50 to 100 years from the date of the first landing. This very fertile, but at the same time steep Poiki Hill Peninsula on the east was settled around AD 1200. The group living there was the only one isolating itself off from the others. They did not use the volcanic Radu Marara Cuff to carve moai. They even dug a special ditch, the Poiki Ditch, separating the peninsula off from the rest of the territory. Notwithstanding such behavior, the population re-emigrated around AD 1500 to the west and north due to a decline in the fertility of the land. Now, New World domesticates arrive. The arrival of American plants probably occurred between 1300 and 1450, and I'm giving the most recent references. The sweet potato, or kumara, and the bottle gourd, or huic, came to Rapa Nui on the Road of the Winds by natural means. Thanks to their modest ecological requirements, for example for humidity, and high nutrient assets, both plants spread very quickly around all of Polynesia, from Hawaii to New Zealand, very often beginning the local staple food. There is no convincing scientific evidence for the hypothesis of an Amerindian visit to Rapa Nui. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the interior of Easter Island, the uplands, remained unused only for a very short period. There is no agreement among researchers as to whether this was because of the dense forest cover or because the population had no need to establish fields and dwellings there. More references. However, by the end of AD 1200s, cultivations, dwellings, and settlements began to spread in this area. And settlement would continue until at least AD 1550. Unfortunately, there is not much more we can say about the periodization of Easter Island on scientific grounds. Now we come to the Ethnographic Era. The crisis of Rapa Nui culture in the year AD 1680 was generally accepted as the beginning of this process. The key phrase here is generally accepted as. Professors Hunt and Lipo published in 2009 a very detailed bibliographical review in an attempt to answer why this particular date should be accepted as the pivotal point in the prehistory of Rapa Nui. During their inquiry, it turned out that the first, and in fact the most important factor, was the local oral tradition. And that tradition holds that near the Poiki Peninsula, on the Poiki Ditch, the long ears and the short ears began a war that eventually led to decimation. Now, the Catholic missionary priest Sebastian Engelbert spent the 30 years from 1935 to 1965 on Easter Island, and he was the first to cite the year 1680 as the date of the battle. He did this based on oral history, genealogical calculations, and the assumption that the story of his informants began being told before Roggeveen's story was written. Then the Norwegian expedition's radiocarbon date of AD 1676 from the layers of Poiki Ditch appeared to provide full confirmation. The discovery that there was no Mata'a, obsidian spear points, on the island before the AD 1600s made it possible for Vernon and Smith to endorse it, and they made it part of the grounds for their chronology of Rapa Nui, and accordingly 1680 came to mark the boundary between the middle and late periods and for obsidian tools resembling stem points. For decades, the 1680 date was treated as established in almost all of the literature. All of this is not only incorrect, it is now irrelevant, in my opinion, as an entirely new and different chronology has been developed. To begin with, it is not even clear if there was a collapse, as opposed to a phase in ATC evolution. nor whether either a supposed collapse or a new phase began before or after contact. And this according to Lipo and Hunt in 2009. Neither the oral tradition nor the legends specify this in any way. Against the common conception that most or all of the Moai were knocked down and crushed during the fighting, the first Dutchman to arrive saw them still standing, and the last ones persisted to the 1800s. There are several archaeological reasons attesting to social changes on Rapa Nui during the period when the Ahu Tongariki was constructed. Some authors say that since this structure, the biggest on the island, was built on the base of some older and smaller ones, it could be proof of clan consolidation. These two authors being Cristino and Vargas in a paper they published in 2002. If this were the case, it would be better to be more specific and see it as the period of ATC consolidation, probably justified by the spread of a unifying religion. Some architectural features are called Marae, M-A-R-A-E, in the South Pacific, after those of Maori, New Zealand. There, a marae is a fenced-in complex of carved buildings and grounds that belong to a particular iwi or tribe, hapu or subtribe, or wanao or family. In 2010, the newest findings on marae development in Polynesia, based on very accurate uranium-thorium dating by Sharp et al., confirm a very intensive Rapa Nui construction episode occurring around AD 1620 to 1760 that then trailed off. The last date is very close to one of the extremes of the calibrated radiocarbon dates. This means that reports from previous expeditions, especially the Norwegian archaeological edition of Thor Heyerdahl of 1955-56, have to be reconsidered, and new archaeological work is necessary. Detailed excavations of Rapa Nui cave archaeological sites would be very helpful in this discussion too, because it turns out that use of the caves during the so-called crisis period is in fact poorly documented, as Lipo and Hunt again point out in their 2009 article. Their function as places of refuge was described by European explorers and travelers, such as Machowski in 1969, has reviewed and then reproduced in the literature, in fact without any archaeological evidence. All we know is that natives disappeared underground. More references. That cave entrances were slung back and masked, and that precious objects and ancestors' remains were collected there. More references. However, there is no proof of their defensive and residential function. First of all, concealed and protected entrances and the installation of symbolic and protective aku-aku representations nearby could be evidence that the caves were primarily used as storage or hiding places of a ceremonial or religious nature, rather than defense structures. Moreover, very narrow and sometimes contorted tunnel entrances are also found in the surface dwellings. And another reference. And finally, it is well documented that in post-contact times, local people lived on the surface, while in the caves they only accumulated heirlooms and capital assets. It was strictly forbidden for all strangers to enter these places. The absence of pottery meant no precise typological chronology has been proposed for Easter Island, only a rather general Ahu typology, and a better, if not very detailed, fishhook classification. In Rapa Nui ideology today, there is a beginning of their history. It is said that in the beginning, Rapa Nui fishermen used only stone fishhooks, but this kind of tool brought only very meager results. So one day, Tirakora, the guardian spirit of the fishermen, visited one of the youngsters and advised him to make a fishhook from his father's bone. This innovation led to much more efficient fishing, but he kept his strategy secret, provoking the odium of others who finally discovered it and killed him. So the story goes. The new fishing tackle became widespread, and we can suspect that the raw material for fishhooks changed over time. Now, the first Easter Island archaeologists turned their attention to the problem of fishhook, that is ROU, R-O-U, typology and chronology. The temporal variability of both the raw material and the shape of these tools were noticed very early, as Malmetral and Ayers have pointed out. However, a certain conservatism due to raw material constraints may also be observed on Rapa Nui, just as, for example, on Pitcairn Island. Materials for roux production were bone, stone, and wood. Shells, very common on other Polynesian islands, were too small in Rapa Nui to make a working fish hook. The rare examples of shell roux from the island are imports, and at the same time serve as signs of interregional contacts. The oldest fish hooks on Easter Island come from the 13th century, which agree with the most recent proposed dating for settlement of all Rapa Nui roux. The two-piece items are the most interesting specimens. Stone was the early raw material for fish hooks because of the absence on the island of shells big enough for the job. They are very often two-piece implements. The dimensions of these tools, as large as 93 millimeters, means they were used for offshore fishing. With time, the length of the hooks decreased to 31 to 33 millimeters, and the material changed to bone: human, whale, bird, chicken, or seal. The mythological information is consistent with archaeological evidence. After contact, metal became the most common material for fish hook production. The Ahu stone heaps were the first structures to be erected, and later they were rebuilt so that moai could be placed on top of them, and later statues were knocked down and broken. From ATC Chief to King. Irving Goldman, in his book Ancient Polynesian Society, published in 1970, concludes that the changes in the social comportment reflect changes in social structural authority. He says military chiefs had begun to replace the exclusive authority of a religious chief called an Ariki, A-R-I-K-I. We should remember that the first Europeans observed that only some of the statues had fallen or had been knocked down, and claimed the islanders worshipped a statue cult. Rainbird reports this in his 2002 paper. Almost 100 years later, some of the moai were still in good standing, in good condition and standing in place, according to Machowski and Lipo and Hunt, and I think this indicates that they were destroyed gradually, and the process escalated after the Europeans landed on the island. Now it seems the history of the island is started with the archaeology we used to assign to the middle period, that is the moai construction period. So this requires either new dating of the moai construction, for example 1300 to 1550, as proposed by Stevenson and Hoa and Van Tilburg, or alternatively accepting the idea that both the Ahu and moai were constructed at the same time, that is 1200 to 1250, or that quite possibly that the period of intense building activity was much later, 1620 to 1760. New studies of other Polynesian mare complexes seem to support this thesis, as Sharp reports in 2010. Unfortunately, the data available today do not allow us to resolve all of the problems. And finally, one of the newest problems for artifact typology is for the mata, the very distinctive stemmed obsidian tools reported by Lipo et al. In 2010. For a long time, on the grounds of the first explorers' reports, the mata were regarded as combat appliances. There was no game to hunt on the island, embedded on shafts. It was assumed that they appeared in the archaeological and ethnographic record only during the war period, Smith and Ferdin's late period. However, tool edgework analysis and photomicrography shows that obsidian tools were commonly used for plant harvesting and cutting. And I can testify from my own photomicrography work on our obsidian tools from Ice Mountain that you can see exactly how these tools were used and exactly how they were made under the microscope. The cutting edge was on the side or on the distal part of the artifact, while its shape was purely functional. Lipo et al. Reports in his 2010 paper, minor variability in stem form is observed, and it's too early for chronological conclusions, but according to the authors, it could testify to the existence of relatively autonomous social groups instead of just one chieftain. This vital observation prompts us to discard the unequivocal association of the mata with military conflicts. The hydration dates on these tools indicate the 1550 to 1800 period. Now, So the connection between the Matas and other cultural changes on the island is still not clear, but it is equally possible that the Binapu clan, which controlled the Obsidian resources, began a more intensive form of barter for food in this period, which coincides with the time when the upland fields were abandoned. Moreover, 1550 to 1650 or 1700 was the apogee of moai production and erection, and thus a period of increasing demand for food production. Hence the Mata could have served equally for agriculture or fighting or for both. And that brings us to a conclusion of our lecture on Easter Island. And next we're going to move to Hawaii.